People in the Alabama Pine Belt still use two names for the same man. The papers called him a mass murderer. Old farmers remember Harlan James Pruitt as the quiet neighbor who slipped sacks of peanuts onto porches when times went lean. On an October evening in 1982, sheriff's cars painted that red dirt with blue light. 11 field hands lay scattered in the rows, bodies twisted between broken vines. Harlan sat beside his pickup, rifle unloaded, hands folded like he was waiting on Sunday service. Beside his boot rested a burlap peanut sack, stained and worn, the faded letters JP just visible in the dust. From the road, it looked senseless, the act of a man who finally snapped. What nobody standing there knew was that Harlan had been planning for months, not only with bullets, but with paper. Tonight we're going back into that field, that family secret, and that stolen sack. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments and subscribe for more stories. To understand that field in 1982, you have to step back a few years, into a stretch of Alabama where the pines run in long straight walls and the money runs thin. In the late 70s, the Pine Belt lived on peanuts, pulpwood, and hope. The hills weren't high like Appalachia, but the code ran the same. A man's word mattered. A man's land mattered. His name most of all. Most days, that code played out at the county co-op. It sat off Highway 84, a low concrete building with one dusty glass door. Inside, the air was fertilizer, motor oil, and popcorn from the old machine by the counter. Men in seed caps watched a corkboard where someone had pinned the latest peanut prices for Montgomery. Harlan Pruitt stood quiet in that crowd. He'd scan the numbers, jot a note in a pocketbook, and listen. Talk at the co-op carried further than any radio. Who'd missed a loan payment, who'd lost a tractor to the bank, which field had washed out in the last hard rain. By 1980, the talk had turned dark. Interest rates climbed, banks called notes. Some farms that had fed 3 generations sat one bad season from the auction block. That pressure didn't show on Harlan's face. He rose before light, worked his small spread, and hauled his peanuts in an old Ford. He still slipped paper sacks of boiled nuts to neighbors whose lights went off for non-payment. "Man's gotta eat," he'd tell May Allen when she frowned at the pantry. She'd sigh. "Man's also gotta pay his notes, Harlan." Down the road, Eddie Garrison fought the same squeeze, but on a bigger scale. He'd stretched to buy more acres in the boom years. Now every acre came with a payment and a clock. From the outside, though, Eddie's place looked like success. New tin roof on the big barn, fresh paint on the farmhouse, mixers and dryers humming long after dark. That mix of pride and fear fed something else in the Pine Belt, the quiet trade in things the law frowned on. Some men cut a little extra pulpwood from land that wasn't theirs. Some ran untaxed liquor in from the hills. Others sold produce off the books and kept cash in coffee tins instead of banks. Harlan knew those shadows. As a younger man, he'd hauled jars for a mountain still up in Clay County, learning 2 truths at once. The government's rules didn't always match right and wrong, and paper left a trail you couldn't always outrun. By 1982, that lesson sat deep in him. He knew the co-op's ledgers could show who was moving how much. He knew banks kept copies of every loan form. He knew his own little notebooks, marked year by year, told a story nobody else could tell. This was an isolated world, but it wasn't cut off. Crop inspectors drove in, wrote notes, drove back out. USDA offices in town held files on every farm. Truckers carried word up to Birmingham and back. The Pine Belt had its own rules, yet it lived under the shadow of bigger ones. Under that pressure, men like Harlan and Eddie started to see legacy not as an idea, but as the only shield they left had. Land could be taken, tractors could be repossessed. A recipe, a seed line, a family craft, that felt like something no banker could touch. They were wrong about that. And when Eddie reached for what wasn't his, he didn't just break a deal, he tugged on the one thread holding Harlan's world together. Back before anyone said the word massacre, Harlan's life moved in small, steady circles. The Pruitt farm sat at the end of a rutted lane, a white house with peeling paint, a couple of weathered sheds, and peanut fields rolling off toward the tree line. Inside that house, the past lived in jars and paper. On a shelf above the kitchen table, glass jars lined up in a neat row. Each held red-brown peanuts, darker than the common kind. Masking tape labels ran across their sides: 64, 71, 78. Harlan had written those years with the same slow hand he used to sign checks. His father, James Pruitt, had brought that seed line down from the Kentucky hills after the war. Folks up there called them Red Runners. James called them our shot at staying Pruitt's our own land. In the evenings, Harlan would sit at that table, ledger open, while May Ellen washed dishes. He'd log acres, rainfall, yield, and who'd bought his boiled peanuts after church the last Sunday. The pages smelled faintly of dust and brine. He didn't talk much, but his mind never stopped counting, weighing, recording. His two sons had already gone off to factory jobs nearer Mobile. The farm hadn't been able to hold them. Still, when they brought their own kids back on holidays, Harlan would scoop a few of the Red Runners into a boy's palm and say, "This is us, don't forget it." The recipe sat on one folded sheet of paper tucked into a Bible that belonged to James. It wasn't fancy. Water, salt, a pinch of something else he'd never named out loud. What mattered wasn't the list, but the line of hands that had passed it down. In town, people knew Harlan for that taste. Saturdays, he'd park by the feed store with a big metal pot in the back of his truck. Steam would roll up, carrying that salty, rich smell down the sidewalk. He never made a killing on it, but he made enough to keep seeds, parts, and pride. Kids would run up with a quarter. Old men would lean on their trucks and say, "Nobody boils 'em like Pruitt." Harlan would nod once, eyes soft for a moment. Under that quiet surface lay skills most folks had forgotten. In Korea, he'd learned to fire a rifle steady under noise that shook your bones. He'd learned to move from cover to cover, to watch a map, to wait. Later, running jars for the still, he'd mastered back roads, timing, and how to remember every turn without a note. Those same habits flowed into his record-keeping. He saved seed invoices from the co-op. He kept letters his father had written about the first plantings. He kept a school notebook filled with early buyers and the dates he'd sold them at church or ball games. If land and machines were slipping, this was what he had left. A name tied to a taste, proven by years of jars and pages. He didn't think in legal terms, he thought in family terms. But without knowing it, he was building something lawyers and judges understand better than anyone else: a paper trail. That trail would later speak when he couldn't, in rooms he'd never see. For now, it just sat in a metal box under his bed, waiting for a storm no one had named. Eddie Lee Garrison didn't look like a man who'd steal from a neighbor. That was part of the problem. His place spread wider than the Pruitt farm, with big center pivot rigs and newer sheds. Eddie liked to talk, liked to clap a man on the back, liked to buy the first round of coffee at the diner. He remembered kids' names, bragged on school ball teams, and showed up at funerals with a covered dish. Under that charm, the numbers on his desk got worse every month. In the office section of his main barn, a wood-paneled room with a humming fridge and a crooked calendar, Eddie sat most nights with a stack of bank letters. Behind him, 3 hired hands shelled sample nuts into plastic tubs. A radio played low. The men joked, but they watched Eddie's face when he opened each envelope. "Another late fee?" one asked one night. Eddie blew a breath. "They're ready to take the place if we hiccup." What he knew, and what Harlan didn't yet, was that bigger money had started sniffing around the Pine Belt. A Birmingham snack company, run by a man named Rick Halford, was testing local peanuts for a new boiled and roasted line they wanted to push in gas stations up and down I-65. Eddie saw that as a lifeline. A contract with that company could fix his loans, maybe even grow his place. He hosted Rick for a tour, walking him past wagons and dryers, talking up the character of his crops. But one thing snagged Halford's interest more than the rest. At a fall festival in town, Harlan had cooked a big pot of his Red Runners. The smell had drifted across the square. Eddie had watched Rick take a paper bag, bite down, and close his eyes. "Lord, that's good," Rick had said. Eddie smiled, but inside he felt something twist. That taste, that simple bag, seemed to pull the future toward the wrong man. Later, in the barn office, Rick had said, "You come up with something like that, Eddie, we can talk real volume." Eddie didn't correct him. He just nodded and poured another cup of coffee. From that seed, the theft grew. One evening, while Harlan helped May Ellen at church, 2 of Eddie's field hands eased their truck up Harlan's lane. They knew where the old man kept his extra seed and culls, a side shed with a simple hasp. The lock wasn't much. The hands slipped it. Inside, they found stacked burlap sacks. One marked JP in faded ink felt heavier, richer when they grabbed it. "Boss said get a sack. This is a sack," one muttered, lifting it into the truck bed. They drove off, dust settling behind them. Back at Eddie's barn, that sack was split open. The Red Runners spilled out like a line of small hearts. Eddie's fingers sifted through them. He knew whose mark that was. He knew which neighbor had boiled that taste into half the county's memory. He told himself it wasn't really stealing. He said out loud to nobody, "We'll tweak it, make it ours." He set his hands to copying the brine he'd watched Harlan use 100 times at church events. Water, salt, time, heat, a little guesswork. Close enough that his first batch made his oldest boy whistle. "Daddy, that's just like Pruitt's." "Better," Eddie said, forcing a grin. From that point on, the line was crossed, even if the law wouldn't have a neat word for it. Eddie taught the method to his sons, to a couple of trusted hands like Caleb Tinsley, and he bagged samples to send up to Birmingham. In his mind, he wasn't robbing a friend, he was saving his own family. In Harlan's world, he just committed the worst kind of theft there was. By the time word reached Harlan, the sack had been gone for weeks. It started as a small wrong feeling. One cool morning, he stepped into the shed and stared at the corner where that JP sack should have sat. Other bags leaned there, stitched and stained, but not that one. He checked twice, ran a hand over each rough side. Nothing. At first, he blamed his own memory. Maybe he'd moved it during the last rain. Maybe he'd planted more than he thought. Days later, at the co-op, he heard a comment that made his skin go tight. Caleb Tinsley stood by the seed counter talking low with another hand. "Garrison's got some new boil on them nuts," Caleb said. "Tastes real familiar." Harlan stepped closer. "What's that?" Caleb shifted, caught off guard. "Oh, Eddie's trying something. His boy brought a bag up to Birmingham. Some company's looking." He tried a smile. "Might do good for the county." That night, Harlan spread his receipts on the kitchen table. Seed invoices, co-op tickets, notes from crop years going back past 70. Each line told him how many sacks he'd filled, how many he'd kept. He did the math twice. Something wrong, May Ellen asked, drying her hands. One sack's not where it ought to be. You're sure you didn't plant it out? I'm sure. He went back through his little notebooks. In the margin of a page from the last harvest, he'd written, J.P. Sack, seed only. That note felt like a witness staring up at him. For the first time, he thought not just about the loss, but what another man could do with that sack, with that seed, with that taste. He pictured Eddie's easy grin, Eddie at the festival watching Rick Halford close his eyes over a Pruitt peanut. Caleb's half-nervous words at the co-op. A cold understanding settled. He could call the sheriff. What would he say? A man took some peanuts and a pinch of salt? No statute in the Alabama Code would cover that. He could sue. For what? The Pruitt name? The smell of his kitchen? In his world, the law never came fast when poor folks lost something that didn't have a serial number. At the diner the next day, he sat in a corner booth, coffee cooling in front of him. He watched Eddie laugh with a salesman at the counter. Harlan opened his pocket notebook and instead of jotting crop prices, started a different list. In one column, he wrote the names of men he knew worked close with Eddie on those new peanuts. In another, he wrote down every year he'd grown the Red Runners, every church sale, every fair. He thought about the mountain way his father had taught him. If a man stole your stock, you took it back and left a mark. If a man stole your name, you did more. Sitting there, in that vinyl booth, he made two choices that would never be undone. First, he decided the law had no part in this. Whatever happened would be between him and those who'd touched what was his. Second, almost on reflex, he started to pull together proof. Receipts folded in his wallet, a copy of his father's old letter about bringing the seed south, notes of who'd bought Pruitt peanuts and when. He didn't think of it as strategy, he thought of it as backing his word. Later, people would say Harlan picked the gun and the paper in the same breath. They weren't wrong. Fog hugged the low places the morning the first man died. Harlan eased his truck along a sand-packed back road, trees crowding close on both sides. The air smelled like damp dirt and diesel. Over the dash, he could see the pale line where peanut fields opened up ahead. Caleb's cousin, Roy, had a habit of cutting across that road at first light, heading to Eddie's farthest plot. Harlan knew this because he'd watched, day after day, from different turns in fence lines. Old soldiers' patience applied to home soil. The truck idled to a stop by a break in the brush. Harlan stepped out, boots sinking a little in the soft edge. He checked his rifle like his hands did it on their own. There was no thrill in him, just a hard, flat line. Down the road, Roy's pickup appeared, headlights dim in the fog. Harlan waited until it drew close, then stepped out, raising one hand. Roy braked, window rolling down. "Mr. Pruitt, you all right?" One clean shot later, the cab glass lay in glittering pieces across the seat. The sound bounced off the trees and died. Harlan stood there a moment, jaw tight. The man in the truck wasn't Eddie, wasn't a bank officer, wasn't some stranger in a city office. He was a field hand who'd learned the stolen brine, who'd carried that taste in buckets to trucks that drove toward Birmingham. That was enough, Harlan told himself. He dragged Roy's body from the cab with effort his back didn't like, laid it in the ditch, and left the rifle print in the sand clear as a signature. Then he climbed back into his truck and drove not home, but to town. His next stop wasn't the sheriff's office. It was the church. Reverend Amos Clay was sweeping the front steps when Harlan pulled up. "Morning, Harlan," the pastor called. "You look like you haven't slept." "Got something for the church safe." Inside the cool, dim hallway, he handed over a thick manila envelope. The weight of it surprised Amos. "What's this?" "Papers, ledgers, my daddy's letter, seed slips. Don't open it unless Sheriff Barrett comes asking why I've done what I'm fixin' to do." Amos stared, broom leaning forgotten against the wall. "Harlan, what are you talking about?" "You'll know when you need to know." Their eyes met. The pastor saw something in that gaze that chilled him more than any draft in that old building. I can't be part of something wrong," Amos said. "That's why I'm here. This ain't to excuse me, it's to tell the truth when I'm not standing." With that, he turned and walked out, boots echoing down the hall. The door shut soft behind him. Back on the road, he felt a strange calm. The first blood had been spilled. The first papers had been set where the law would someday find them. He knew there'd be no going back now. He also knew that when folks in uniforms and suits tried to shape this story, they'd have to deal with the trail he'd laid. Every step from here on would deepen both paths, the one cut by bullets and the one written in ink. In a place where men trusted handshakes more than documents, he'd chosen to lean on both. And out in the fields, other men on Eddie Garrison's payroll started their day, not yet knowing their names already sat in Harlan Pruitt's small, neat handwriting. One of those names belonged to Caleb Tinsley's cousin, J.D. That same morning, while Roy's blood soaked into the ditch, J.D. rolled out of bed in a single-wide trailer behind Eddie Garrison's main barn. His wife packed his lunch in a grocery sack, a baby fussing on her hip. She kissed his cheek, told him to be careful on the tractors. Neither of them knew his name was already inked in Harlan's notebook. By midday, word of a body on the back roads started to drift through the crews. Men talked low over diesel engines. Some said it was a wreck, others whispered a shot. Eddie told them to keep working, face tight. Caleb heard more than most. Roy was family. When somebody mentioned a dented pickup and shattered glass, his stomach dropped. He stepped away from the picker and called the sheriff's office from a payphone. Nobody told him much, but the silence on the other end felt heavy. That night, he met Eddie at a dim roadside barn near the county line. Cigarette smoke hung under the ceiling fan. A jukebox played something slow. "You hear about Roy?" Caleb asked, voice rough. Eddie nodded once, jaw clenched. "Sheriff thinks it's Pruitt. Who else would be crazy enough?" Caleb stared. "Over that recipe? Over some boiled peanuts?" Eddie's voice sharpened. "Ain't just peanuts. It's a whole market. You know what Birmingham's offering. You want this place to dry up? You want your little trailer gone? That man gave us food when Daddy was out of work. He taught me how to pick without tearing the vines." Eddie leaned close. "I just did what I had to so my boys don't lose this land." Caleb felt the floor tilt. He'd helped with the test batches. He'd seen the sack marked JP. He hadn't asked enough questions. "You keep working. Sheriff will calm this down. Folks will forget Roy. They always do." On the drive home, Caleb passed the dark line of pines and thought about how fast a man could turn from neighbor to target. He pictured his own name on some invisible list. By week's end, 2 more of Eddie's men were dead on different roads, each seen carrying the same cold neatness sheriff's deputies would later call Pruitt's signature. Engines still running, no wallets taken, nothing but a bullet and a body, and tire tracks leading nowhere. The county felt it. Wives told husbands not to take side jobs with Eddie. Mothers watched the school bus a little longer as it pulled away. Caleb looked at his cousin J.D.'s kids and understood there wasn't any middle ground left. Staying on Eddie's payroll meant standing in the line of fire. Quitting meant losing his main check, his insurance, his small hope of getting out of debt. He walked into the barn office one evening, handed Eddie his gloves, and said he needed some time. Eddie stared at him like a stranger. "You walk away now," Eddie warned. "Don't come back when things turn around." "Gotta think about my family," Caleb answered. Outside, the sun dropped behind the tree line, throwing long shadows across Eddie's neat rows. Caleb knew he'd just stepped off the safer path, such as it was, and onto one where both sides might see him as disposable. What he didn't yet know was that leaving Eddie would make him the one man able to tell the whole story about the stolen sack, the Birmingham deal, and the contract that tied it all together on paper. That story would cost him too. The killings didn't come all at once. They crept through the pine belt like a slow brush fire, flaring here, smoldering there, always moving. In the weeks after Roy and the others fell, Harlan watched. He parked his truck at field edges, behind tree lines, on rise tops where he could see who came and went. Old war habits surfaced. Count the heads, watch the patterns, learn the rhythm of another man's operation. From one hill, he saw Eddie's oldest boy loading bags of boiled peanuts into the back of a panel van with an out-of-county plate. From another, he spotted J.D. and two other hands carrying buckets from the cook shed to a truck bound for town. Each sighting confirmed what his gut already knew. The stolen brine had spread through Eddie's crew like seed on the wind. Harlan didn't take every shot he could. Sometimes he'd watch a man step out of a truck, see a child run from a porch to grab that man's leg and lower the rifle. His code wasn't kind, but it was narrow. No kids, no women, no killing in front of them if he could help it. The weight of each name pressed on him at night. He'd sit at his kitchen table, ledger open, and draw lines between men, fields, and dates. In one corner of a page, he copied a few sentences from an old letter his father had written describing the trip south with the original seed. That letter sat folded beside another piece of paper Caleb had slipped him one nervous afternoon. They'd met by a shaded creek bottom where field hands like to eat lunch. No one else was there, just the slow trickle of water and the buzz of insects. "Eddie's got a deal brewing," Caleb said, eyes scanning the tree line. "Birmingham Company. This is a copy of what they faxed down." He held out a crumpled, smoke-stained sheet. The top corner bore the snack company's name and a few legible lines: volume, price, exclusive rights, and, most important, Garrison Family Boyle. They're going to put his name on it, not yours, not your daddy's. Harlan read the words slowly. The contract fragment felt like a stone in his hand. "Why you bringing me this?" he asked. "Because Roy's gone, JD's scared, and I don't think they'll stop with just your name," Caleb answered. "They'll own what you built, and nobody'll remember where it came from." Harlan folded the paper with care and slid it into his notebook. "The sheriff needs to see that," Caleb added. "Sheriff will see it when he's ready," Harlan replied. He looked up at the trees. "Appreciate you." When Caleb walked back toward the road, shoulders hunched, Harlan stayed by the creek a while, listening. The fragment in his pocket confirmed what the missing sack had suggested. This wasn't petty theft, it was erasure, printed in ink. That night, under a single kitchen light, he pressed that sheet flat and copied the important parts into his ledger, adding the date, the company name, and the phrase, Garrison Family Boyle. In another column, he wrote, Pruitt Red Runner, original, underlined twice. The killings he planned would speak one language, the papers he gathered another. You can see the divide here, even from years away. One side of Harlan believed in taking blood back for blood. The other side believed in something quieter but just as permanent, a record nobody could scrub. He was closing in on both fronts. The list of men who knew the stolen method was nearly complete. The stack of documents tying that method back to his own line was thickening. All that remained was to fix both things in place before Eddie signed that full contract and the state called his family's work by another man's name. The evening before everything broke open, a strange stillness settled over the Pruitt place. Clouds hung low, pressing the last light flap across the fields. Harlan sat alone at his kitchen table, a county road map spread over the oilcloth. Small pencil marks dotted certain roads and field entrances. Each mark matched a name in his notebook. Drivers, field bosses, Boyle men, all tied to Eddie's stolen product. Beside the map lay that contract fragment from Birmingham, his father's letter, and several co-op receipts bearing Pruitt in fading type. He moved each piece as if arranging evidence for a judge only he could see. Earlier that day, he'd driven into town and climbed the steps to a narrow law office on the courthouse square. The sign on the glass door read, "Carla Jenkins, Attorney at Law." Dusty blinds filtered the sunlight. Carla had known him for years through simple deeds and wills. When he said he needed to fix up some papers for the boys, she didn't ask many questions. In her cramped office, he'd signed a short trust document naming the Pruitt Red Runner peanut line and boiled peanut recipe as assets placed in the hands of his sons and any grandchildren. Carla typed the words just as he said them, eyebrows slightly raised. "Most folks don't list recipes in a trust," she remarked. "Most folks don't have much else," he replied. He left with copies in a manila folder, which he handed back across her desk almost immediately. "If the sheriff ever comes here about me, or if you hear I've been took in, you give him that folder, all of it. Don't hold nothing back." Carla studied his face. "Harlan, what are you fixin' to do?" He met her gaze, the same calm he'd shown the pastor. "Make sure my daddy's name don't die wrong." Back home, he tucked his personal copies into the metal box under his bed, alongside the old seed jars and his ledgers. Then he walked the fields, rows stretching into the dim, tracing the seams of his life with a lantern beam. At the fence line nearest Eddie's property, he paused. Sounds drifted over, an engine shutting off, men laughing, a radio. He pictured sacks of boiled peanuts being loaded, a corporate man somewhere up the road waiting on samples. In that gray in-between hour, he wasn't thinking about the 11 men who'd fall. He was thinking about a boy in Korea promising himself that if he ever came home, he'd do right by his people's name. He was thinking about his father's calloused hands pressing those first red runners into southern soil. Back at the table, he folded the map, slid it into his jacket, and checked his rifle once more. His movements had the slow precision of ritual, not frenzy. When he finally turned off the kitchen light, the house fell into darkness except for the dim glow from that metal box, still open a crack, papers inside like banked coals. By morning, those coals would ignite into something the Pine Belt had never seen. If you're still with this story, remember this point. The night before, the map, the trust paper, the choice to set ink alongside gunpowder. It's where intent turns fully into plan. The dawn waiting on the other side of that night would put 11 bodies on the ground and drag every scrap of Harlan's paperwork into the brightest light the county had. Dawn on the day of the Maine killings came clear and sharp. The fog burned off by a bright sun that made every edge in the field stand out. Harlan left his driveway before most kitchen lights flipped on. The map in his pocket dictated the order. A driver taking boiled peanuts toward town, a field boss checking irrigation at a back plot, 2 Boyle men starting fires under big pots behind Eddie's barn. By mid-morning, the sheriff's office received its first call. A truck sat skewed across a dirt lane, driver slumped over the wheel, steam still hissing from radiator hoses. A passerby thought it was a heart attack until he saw the neat hole in the glass. Deputies rolled out, lights flashing. They hadn't cleared that scene when the second call came, a man down near an irrigation pump. Then a third, gunshots behind Garrison's main cook shed. Back and forth, sirens cut through the air, bouncing off the pines. Farmers stepped out of their tractors, shading their eyes. Wives turned down stove burners and listened. By early afternoon, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Each victim had ties to Eddie's operation. Each one had worked with the new boiled peanut line, either in the field or at the pots. Nothing was taken. Wallets, watches, trucks, all left untouched. Inside the sheriff's dispatch room, a big county map hung on the wall. With every call, a deputy stuck another colored pin into the board. The cluster around Eddie's holdings grew. Sheriff Lonnie Barrett stood with one hand on his hip, the other rubbing his temple. "This is one man," he told his deputies. "This is a sweep." Even as they scrambled, the final scene was already being set at the edge of Harlan's own property. Late afternoon, the light took on that golden cast the pine belt gets in fall. Harlan parked his truck near the front of his lane, far enough from the house to give officers room. He laid his rifle on the hood, action open, then sat on an overturned bucket and waited. Beside his boot, he placed the old burlap sack marked JP that he'd kept hidden even after the theft. It wasn't the stolen one. That had been gutted weeks back. This was another from the same run, a twin, saved for seed. In his mind, it stood in for everything that had gone missing. The first cruiser rolled into view as the sun started to drop. Dust curled under its tires. From the cab, Sheriff Barrett saw Harlan sitting there, still as a fence post, the gun in plain sight. "Lord help us," Barrett muttered, reaching for his radio. While that meeting unfolded at the lane, another quiet moment happened across town. In the cool hallway of First Baptist, Reverend Amos Clay turned the key on the church office door, heart pounding. He'd been hearing sirens all day. Now someone had called, "It's Harlan." He set the manila envelope on his desk, hands shaking, and slid it open. Ledgers, seed invoices, a handwritten letter from James Pruitt dated in the 50s, a copied fragment of the Birmingham snack contract with Garrison Family Boyle underlined, a short note from Harlan. "This won't save me. It might save the truth." Amos read, lips moving. Then he picked up the phone and dialed DA Pat Holbrook's number. "Patricia," he said when she answered, "you need to get down here. Before you write this man off as just crazy, you better see what he put in my hands." That call began the formal part of Harlan's second plan, the one measured not in shots, but in sheets of paper. By evening, the sheriff's lot looked like a storm shelter before a tornado. Cars jammed every space. Reporters from Montgomery and Birmingham idled at the curb, hungry for a quote. Inside, in a windowless squad room that smelled of coffee and copier toner, DA Pat Holbrook spread Harlan's papers across a long metal table. Sheriff Barrett, Reverend Clay, and two investigators leaned over the mess. They started with the ledgers. Year after year, Harlan had logged acres planted in the Red Runners, yields, and hand-to-hand sales of boiled peanuts. Names of buyers, dates, even notes about church events. In the margins, small stars marked the first times certain people tasted his recipe. Next, they studied seed invoices from the co-op, all bearing the Pruitt name and specific lot numbers. These matched entries in the co-op's own books once a deputy fetched copies. Then came James Pruitt's letter. In careful script, James described bringing a hardy Red Runner strain from Kentucky, saving seed, and teaching his son the right boil. He wrote about wanting the Pruitt name tied to something good after rough years. Finally, Pat picked up the contract fragment with the snack company's letterhead. The words Garrison Family Boyle and exclusive rights glared up at her. Beneath, in Harlan's neat hand, someone had written, "This is theft of birthright." "You're telling me he killed 11 men over this?" one investigator said, tapping the page. Amos Clay shook his head. "Over what it means, over being wiped out of his own story." Before Pat could answer, a deputy stuck his head in. "Caleb Tinsley's here. Says he won't talk without the DA." They brought Caleb into the squad room, set him in a metal chair. His clothes still smelled faintly of diesel and field dust. His hands twisted non-stop in his lap. Pat slid the contract fragment toward him. "Ever seen this?" He swallowed. "That there's part of the deal Eddie was talking about. Birmingham outfit. Wanted volume. Wanted brand." He hesitated, then pointed. "That line, Garrison Family Boyle, that's what set Pruitt off, I reckon." "How do you know what set Pruitt off?" Barrett asked. Caleb licked his lips. "I took him a copy, by the creek. Didn't feel right them putting Eddie's name on what everybody knows is Pruitt's Boyle." Piece by piece, the story came out. The stolen sack, the testing in Eddie's barn, Rick Halford's visit, the festival where Halford first tasted Harlan's peanuts, the plan to sign a full contract within weeks. With each detail, the papers on the table shifted from background to backbone. Pat scribbled notes. "We've got motive tied to a specific economic harm. We've got documentary proof this recipe and seed line came from the Pruitts and that Garrison tried to rebrand it for profit." Barrett frowned. "He still killed 11 men, Pat." "I know. This doesn't excuse a thing, but it changes how this will be written and who else might be named in civil or regulatory actions." She thought about the snack company executive in Birmingham, likely sitting down to supper, unaware that his faxed draft had just been added to a homicide file. To you watching this now, it might seem strange that in the middle of a murder investigation, a DA is already thinking about contracts and seed rights. But that's how systems work. One arm handles the blood, another handles the paper. Sometimes they touch. Here, Harlan had forced them to. By the time they walked Caleb back to a holding cell for protective custody, Pat had decided on her path. She'd charge Harlan with every count the law allowed. She'd also subpoena the full contract from Birmingham, lock it into evidence, and later use it to pressure that company into recognizing on the record where their prized flavor had truly come from. The massacre would fill headlines. The paper trail would fill case files. Both would carry the Pruitt name. News of the killings and the strange story behind them spread through the Pine Belt faster than any newspaper truck. At the general store, men in work boots lined up for coffee, their voices low. Some had lost kin, others had worked under Eddie or Harlan or both. The radio behind the counter crackled with bulletins between country songs. "They say Pruitt did it 'cause Eddie stole his recipe," one man muttered. "Recipe?" another scoffed. "You don't shoot a man over salt water." An older farmer shook his head. "Ain't just salt. That's his daddy's name in that pot. Y'all know that." Across town at the beauty shop, women under dryers traded versions. A cousin said Harlan had left a note at the church. Someone else swore the Birmingham company was sending lawyers. Talk shifted between horror at the 11 bodies and grudging acknowledgement that Eddie had crossed a line long before the first shot. Inside the co-op, the corkboard that once held only prices now held a photocopy of a notice. All legal questions regarding Pruitt Red Runner peanuts to be directed to Carla Jenkins, attorney. Someone had tacked it up without fanfare. Below, a man had scrawled in pen, "Pruitt's, not Garrison's." Nobody admitted to writing it. The local code and the written law rubbed against each other like rough boards. Some folks said Harlan had done what the old ways demanded. "You don't steal a man's name," they said. "He just carried it too far." Others couldn't get past the number of dead. "There's rules," a deacon at Harlan's church said quietly. "Even in the mountains, there's rules. This went past any of them." In living rooms, families watched TV reports that turned their county into a headline. farm massacre over peanut recipe, one station called it. Viewers saw aerial shots of fields, the sheriff's map with pushpins, grainy photos of Harlan and Eddie side by side from better days at a county fair. None of those clips captured the texture of the place, the weight of long seasons, the way debt sits on a man's shoulders, the pride in a jar of seed passed down. But they framed the story for people far away who would never stand in that red dirt. If you're from somewhere like this, you know how it feels when outsiders tell your stories. There's a mix of shame and anger, a desire to hide, and a need to correct. Older men at the feed bins argued over whether Harlan was evil or just the only one willing to act. Younger ones, who'd grown up with more TV than tales, shook their heads and said, "Crazy old man," without seeing themselves in him. Meanwhile, at First Baptist, Reverend Clay tried to thread a narrow path in his sermon. He spoke of Cain and Abel, of legacies and jealousy. He hinted at systems that fail the least among us without naming banks or corporations, because he knew some of those men sat in his pews. He also prayed by name for the widows left behind, for Eddie's surviving kin, and for Harlan, now in a cell. Out in the parking lot afterward, folks divided into little circles, each retelling what they'd heard. In every version, the burlap sack and the recipe took on more weight. Some called it cursed now. That moral fog between old honor and modern law, between sympathy and condemnation, would follow the case into the courthouse. It would shape jury selection, hallway whispers, and how children learn to speak the name Pruitt in school. If you're finding this story through a screen, ask yourself, in your town, which story would take root? The one about a mad farmer, or the one about a man pushed past his limit when the rules he believed in collided with a world that didn't care about them? Back at the county jail, under fluorescent lights that hummed like insects, Harlan Pruitt sat at a metal table with his hands cuffed in front of him. He'd walked into custody without a fight. At the end of his lane, when Sheriff Barrett had stepped from the cruiser, gun drawn, Harlan had stood up from his bucket, raised both palms, and said one sentence, "I'll answer for what I've done." Now, hours later, the recorder on the table blinked red. DA Pat Halbrook clicked her pen and started the formal interview. "Harlan James Pruitt," she said, "you understand you're being questioned in connection with 11 homicides." "I do," he answered. She asked him to describe his movements that day. He did, step by step, without flourish. Each location matched a pushpin on the sheriff's map. He didn't hesitate when naming the men he'd shot. He didn't claim self-defense. When Pat asked why, he glanced at the corner where a cardboard bank box sat on the floor. Harlan's ledgers and papers, delivered earlier by Carla Jenkins and Reverend Clay. "My daddy brought a line of seed down from Kentucky. He told me that was our way to keep our name on our own land. Eddie took that, sold it off to men who never shook my hand, and put his name on top." Pat listened, but she guided him back to specifics. "You knew about the Birmingham company?" "I seen the paper. Knew once they signed all anybody'd remember is Garrison family Boyle." She slid a document across the table, the trust Carla had drafted. "Why did you set this up before the shootings?" "So when I'm gone, whatever's left of that name stays with my boys. Didn't think y'all'd listen to a poor dirt farmer without some stamps on his side." Here, the power dynamic shifted in a way that doesn't show on arrest reports. On paper, Harlan was the accused, the one with everything to lose. Yet the story he'd anchored in those documents was already tugging on larger forces. Corporate lawyers, insurance investigators, maybe even agricultural regulators who'd never set foot in the county. Barrett watched him with a mix of anger and reluctant respect. "You could have brought those papers to me, Harlan. We could have talked. And you'd have arrested Eddie for what? Harlan asked. Taking some peanuts? You know better. He wasn't right, and they all knew it. Pat ended the interview after securing a clear, voluntary confession. As deputies led Harlan back to his cell, she stayed behind with the box of documents, mind working. Later that week, she'd send certified letters to the Birmingham company, enclosing subpoenas and copies of the contract fragment. She'd notify the state attorney general's office that a homicide case now included potential fraudulent branding and theft of agricultural intellectual property. Words far from the red dirt, but tied to it by Harlan's ink. For now, though, the visible power reversal was simple. The man who'd once walked free among the fields was behind bars. The neighbor others had called kind sat in a narrow concrete room, his future narrowed to decades and routines. If you're watching and wondering whether any part of this felt like victory to him, the answer is complicated. He accepted the cuffs without flinching. He also knew that, thanks to the papers he'd seeded through the town, the people who'd tried to erase his legacy were no longer invisible in the story. His own fall had dragged them into the light. The trial of State versus Pruitt turned the old county courthouse into a stage. On the first day, folks lined the steps before dawn, hoping for a seat. Some knew the victims. Others just wanted to see the man at the center of every conversation. Reporters set up tripods on the lawn, beneath oak trees that had watched a century of smaller scandals. Inside, the wooden pews creaked under the weight of farmers in clean jeans, widows in dark dresses, and curious teenagers on summer break. Ceiling fans turned lazily overhead, stirring hot air and whispers. Harlan came in shackled, flanked by deputies. He wore a plain shirt and slacks, no tie. He didn't scan the crowd. His eyes went to the front, where the judge sat, and then to the table where his lawyer, a weary public defender, shuffled files. The prosecution's case on the killings themselves was straightforward. Ballistics, scene photos, eyewitness timelines. Each piece pointed in the same direction. Jurors saw images of trucks in ditches, bodies in fields, the rows of peanuts interrupted by dark stains. But when it came time to address motive, the trial took on a second life. D.A. Pat Halbrook called Reverend Clay, Carla Jenkins, Caleb Tinsley, and a co-op manager. One by one, they testified about papers Harlan had placed in their hands before the shootings. Jurors saw copies of his ledgers, pages filled with careful script marking years of Pruitt Red Runner crops and sales. They saw James Pruitt's letter about bringing the seed south. They saw Carla's trust document naming the recipe and seed line as family assets. They saw the Birmingham draft contract fragment, paired with a full copy obtained by subpoena. On the witness stand, Caleb's voice shook as he talked about Eddie's excitement over the deal, the way he'd called it our ticket out, and how he'd never once mentioned Pruitt's name to the snack company. "You knew this was Pruitt's recipe?" Pat asked. "Yes, ma'am," Caleb said. Everybody did. The defense argued that the theft of legacy, while real in a moral sense, didn't justify murder. They painted a picture of a man undone by age, war memories, and economic stress, begging for mercy without denying guilt. In closing, Pat spoke directly to the split sitting in every person there. You may understand why Mr. Pruitt was angry. You may even share his sense that the system failed to protect what mattered most to him. But our law cannot make room for a man to appoint himself judge, jury, and executioner. 11 men are dead. The jury deliberated less than a day. They returned guilty verdicts on all counts of murder. Yet even as the judge pronounced life sentences, something else happened in that courtroom that would outlast Harlan's years. The official record now tied the Pruitt name, not Garrison's, to that heirloom peanut and brine. Transcripts recorded every mention of Pruitt Red Runner and Garrison family boil. Exhibits logged Harlan's ledgers and James's letter. The snack company, facing the prospect of being named in civil suits by victims' families and bad press for profiting from stolen heritage, quietly settled with those families and dissolved its planned product line. Decades later, when historians and lawyers open those dusty files, they don't just see a killer, they see the full tangle: legacy, theft, blood, and paper. If you're here for tidy endings, this isn't one. A man who committed terrible acts lost his freedom, as he should have under the law. At the same time, he forced institutions to recognize a kind of theft they'd ignored until bullets made it impossible to look away. Prison shrank Harlan's world to concrete, steel, and schedules. The first weeks blurred into a haze of head counts, chow lines, and hard bunks. The sounds, metal doors clanging, voices echoing, distant shouts, were different from the fields, yet his body adapted. He rose early, did push-ups by his bunk, kept his small state-issued pad as old as his old ledgers. Mail became his new harvest. May Ellen wrote once a week, scrawling across lined paper about weather, bills, and grandkids' ball games. Carla sent occasional updates about legal matters, the quiet settlement the Birmingham company had reached with victims' families, the dissolution of the Garrison Family Boyle project, the way the Pruitt Family Trust now appeared in state agricultural filings. One visit, she sat across from him in the prison visiting room, vending machines humming behind her. They wanted this to go away, she said, keeping her voice low. The company, Eddie's folks, the bank. Settled fast, no more product, no more brand. But the AG's office insisted on one filing that notes Pruitt Red Runner as the original source. He nodded slowly. So it's on paper now. It is, she said. Doesn't change where you are, Harlan. He looked around at the gray walls, the line of men waiting for their turn at the tables. Wasn't expecting it to. In time, other prisoners learned pieces of his story. Some called him Peanut. A few treated him like a kind of outlaw folk figure. He never bragged. When asked, he just said, "I did what I did. The courts said that's murder. They're right." Deep at night, lying on a narrow mattress, he'd turn his face to the wall and think about the 11 men whose lives had ended between rows of vines. He remembered where they'd stood at church picnics, the jokes they'd told at the co-op, the kids who'd run to meet them at the bus. Whatever satisfaction he'd felt at securing his family's name was always shadowed by that lineup of faces. Occasionally, a letter would come not from May Ellen or Carla, but from someone unexpected. One widow wrote to say she hated him for what he'd done, but agreed Eddie had wronged him. Another, a nephew of one of the dead hands, said he was proud the Birmingham company had been forced to back down. "I can hold two thoughts," that nephew wrote, "that you shouldn't have killed my uncle, and that you weren't crazy about what you believed was stolen." Years rolled. His hair went white. Arthritis stiffened fingers that had once snapped peanut shells with ease. Yet he kept a mental tally of what his papers had set in motion outside. Settlements, policy tweaks in how the state tracked specialty crop branding, a small grant program that later helped his grandsons grow a few rows of red runners again, this time entirely above board. You might wonder whether he ever wished he'd only used the paper, left the rifle in the cabinet. From what we know, snatches from letters, a pastor's memory of a prison visit, the answer drifted somewhere between regret and stubbornness. He owned the wrong he'd done. He also never fully surrendered the belief that, without the shock of the killings, no one powerful would have cared about a poor farmer's stolen legacy. That belief, right or wrong, is part of what makes this story stick under your skin. Outside the prison walls, the people left behind lived with holes no court could fill. In a small house near a church, Roy's widow folded uniforms that no longer had a wearer. Her children grew up on Social Security checks and a modest settlement from the snack company. Every fall, when peanut dust floated in the air, she kept the windows shut and the TV loud. On a rise overlooking a cluster of graves, granite markers stood in a line. Brothers, cousins, fathers. Some bore photographs sealed in small ovals. The wind up there sounded like the hush in a courtroom after a verdict. Eddie Garrison never faced criminal charges. He died of a sudden heart attack not long after the killings. Stress and shame pressing on a body already worn by hard years and harder choices. His widow wrestled with a different kind of loss. The land they'd stretched to buy was carved up in auctions. Their boys scattered, some leaving the state entirely to get away from the Garrison name. Caleb Tinsley, whose testimony had helped the state stitch together the story, took his family north. He found work in a factory, far from fields and co-ops. On evenings when the light hit right, he said he could still see rows of peanuts in his mind. He didn't tell his new co-workers about the cousin who died in a ditch or the contract fragment that had passed through his hands like a hot coal. For the Pruitts, life narrowed and lengthened at the same time. May Ellen stayed on the farm as long as she could, renting out fields, living small. Church folks were kind in public, guarded in private. Some avoided her eyes, not knowing what to say. Her sons carried a double weight: pride in the recognition the family recipe finally received and shame at the cost of that recognition. One of them, James's namesake, kept a jar of Red Runners on his kitchen counter in another county. He'd shake it sometimes, listening to the rattle, thinking of his father's lined face behind glass in a visiting room. Victims' children grew up hearing two overlapping stories about why their fathers never came home. In one, they were innocent men taken by a madman. In another, they were pieces on a board moved by bigger forces, caught between a thief and the man he stole from. Some chose anger, burning hot whenever Harlan's name came up. Others found their fury redirected towards Eddie, the bank, the distant company, or a world that lets such stakes build around a sack of peanuts. The thing about acts like this is they don't end with sentencing. They echo in schoolyard whispers, in which last names kids are told never to marry into, in what dishes show up at funerals. For years, at church potlucks, someone would bring boiled peanuts, then apologize under their breath, unsure if the dish itself had turned into a symbol too heavy for a paper plate. Meanwhile, the Pruitt recipe sat in a folder at Carla Jenkins's office and in the trust records downtown. It also sat, less formally, in the memories of women who'd watched Harlan at church cookouts and in the hands of a grandson who years later would test his own batch on a backyard burner. All of them lived with the same question, even if they never said it out loud. Could there have been another way? Time doesn't stop in places marked by tragedy. It just lays new layers over the old ones. By the late 1990s, the Pine Belt looked different. Some peanut fields had given way to scrub and subdivisions. Clear-cut patches marked where timber companies had moved through with big machines. A new highway bypassed parts of town that once saw steady farm traffic. The county co-op still stood, though someone had replaced the front sign and painted the block walls. Inside, a younger manager stocked shelves with more bagged feed and fewer bulk bins. On one end of the corkboard, stapled among equipment flyers, hung a small laminated notice from the State Agriculture Department about heirloom crop preservation. If you looked close, you'd see a line in that notice mentioning locally adapted varieties such as the Pruitt Red Runner peanut, eligible for small grants and marketing help. Few shoppers stopped to read that paragraph, but it represented a quiet shift. The state now recognized in formal language that certain family-kept strains had value worth protecting. In a county commission meeting room, fluorescent lights buzzing, a young extension agent once pitched a pilot program to promote heritage farm products as a way to draw tourists and specialty buyers. She used slides showing old labels, recipes, and seed jars. One slide bore a black-and-white photo of James Pruitt next to his son, younger and unburdened, holding a jar of Red Runners. No one in that room said the word massacre. It floated there anyway, unspoken. Some commissioners worried that leaning into that history would dredge up pain. Others saw opportunity. People like a story. Maybe we can tell it so it helps folks instead of just hurting. Outside official rooms, other changes weren't so hopeful. As factories closed and the opioid crisis spread, young men gathered not at the co-op, but in parking lots, swapping pills instead of seed. The old moonshine routes became meth corridors. The same isolation and poverty that had once driven men to defend every scrap of legacy now fed different kinds of ruin. The killings of '82 became a kind of legend, told in half-whispers. Some softened the details for younger ears, turning 11 into a few and rifles into trouble. Others embellished, adding candles and curses that never were. Once, a regional TV crew returned to do a Where Are They Now piece on the county. They filmed the old fields, the cemetery hillside, a shot of the co-op sign. In voiceover, they mentioned a notorious farm shooting over a family recipe, then cut to a cheerful farmer's market scene. On the edge of town, one of Harlan's grandsons planted a few rows of Red Runners behind his double-wide, using seeds saved in his family for decades. He registered the variety with the state, filled out forms his grandfather never would have trusted, and sold small bags at a roadside table under a handwritten sign, Pruitt Red Runner, boiled or raw. Older locals would sometimes slow down, look, then drive on, unsure how they felt about handing money across for that name. Travelers with no knowledge of 1982 bought a bag, chewed, nodded, and moved on. That's how legacies shift. They move from private code to public program, from whispered guilt to printed brochures. The system that had once ignored Harlan's claim now held a place for it, even as it failed to fix many other hurts in the same county. The land remembered everything, of course. In certain light, tire ruts still showed on back roads where bodies once fell. In certain winds, a person standing alone at the fence line could almost hear distant sirens. Years after the last appeal window closed and Harlan's files settled into an archive box, a historian named Dr. Leela McCord opened it on a metal table in a university library 2 states away. She'd grown up far from peanuts and pine straw, but stories of rural violence and honor codes interested her. When she found a brief mention of an Alabama farm massacre over a peanut recipe in an old law review, she requested the full record. Outspilled transcripts, exhibits, co-op copies, trust documents, and grainy photos. She read James Pruitt's letter, Harlan's ledgers, the Birmingham contract, and Caleb's trembling testimony. She stacked them beside autopsy reports and scene diagrams, the cold, technical language of death. Patterns emerged. One pattern traced how formal systems had failed to see intangible heritage as something worth guarding until it became attached to a corporate asset. As long as the recipe lived in an old man's hands and a small notebook, there was no form to fill, no box to tick. Once it promised profit for a company, it generated contracts, branding plans, and legal vocabulary. Another cut along the grain of what you might recognize as an honor culture. Harlan and Eddie grew from the same soil: hard work, pride, fear of losing what little they had. Faced with the same pressure, Eddie chose quiet theft wrapped in charm and paperwork of his own. Harlan chose overt violence and, ironically, his own brand of paperwork to anchor his side of the story. Dr. McCord wrote about how the law carved reality. It punished the bodies stacked in the fields, as it should, yet only grudgingly acknowledged the prior wrong that lit the fuse. She explored how many people, especially rural poor, see institutions as distant and unhelpful, forcing them back on older, bloodier codes when their identities are threatened. In lectures, she sometimes asked her students, if your family had one inheritance, one craft, one story, one seed, and you believed someone richer was stealing it with no consequence, what would you do? Would you trust the law or something else? Most said they'd hire a lawyer, file a suit, go to the media. A few, often those from hard places themselves, said quietly, I don't know. Depends who believed me. The Pruitt case, as she framed it, became less about peanuts than about the collision between two systems of justice. On one side, state law with its codes, procedures, and limits. On the other, a local ethic that said certain lines, once crossed, had to be answered personally. Neither system looks noble under bright lights. The state ignored a kind of theft until blood demanded attention. The local code gave one man permission in his own mind to end 11 lives to defend a name. Sitting wherever you are, listening to this story, it's easy to say what should have happened. It's harder when you imagine the weight of debt letters, the slow drip of respect being taken, the sense that no one with a badge or a briefcase will lift a finger until your pain affects a balance sheet. That doesn't excuse Harlan's choices. It does force us to ask what responsibilities systems have to see and protect non-material legacies before desperate, violent men try to do it themselves. And it leaves a lingering discomfort. How many other small inheritances disappear quietly without anyone ever picking up a gun, erased not by bullets, but by paperwork that only tells one side? If you drive through that stretch of Alabama today, you might pass a gas station with a hand-painted sign out front, boiled peanuts, hot. Under a faded canopy, a man stands over a steaming pot, plastic cups stacked beside him. On the side of the cooler, a laminated newspaper clipping flutters in the breeze. The headline reads, Pine Belt Massacre Still Haunts County 40 Years Later. Below, someone has taped a newer printout, a short article about heirloom crops featuring a photo of red-skinned peanuts and the caption, Local Family Revives Pruitt Red Runner Variety. Travelers step up, hand over a few dollars and ask for some of those. They pop the shells, taste the salt, and maybe glance at the clippings without really reading. For them, it's just a snack on the way to somewhere else. Locals see more. Some avert their eyes, not wanting to relive 1982. Others feel a sting of pride that for all the ugliness, the wider world now knows that name belonged to someone here, not to a company logo in a distant city. Back in a quiet cemetery, Harlan lies under a simple stone. The markers for the men he killed are scattered on nearby hills. On Sundays, wind moves through the grass, carrying the same dust that once clung to boots and truck tires on the day everything broke. This story doesn't offer easy heroes. A man who loved his family and honored his father's work became a killer. Another man who wanted to save his own kin chose betrayal that lit the fuse. Systems built to keep order only stepped in forcefully after blood hit the soil. What remains are questions. How much is a name worth? A recipe? A jar of seed? When the law fails to see the value of those things, does it share blame for what follows? Or does all responsibility rest on the person who pulls the trigger? If you grew up with your own family traditions, maybe a song, a craft, a bit of land, ask yourself honestly, what would you do if someone richer and louder tried to claim it as theirs and no one in power seemed to care? Would you walk away? Fight in court for years you couldn't afford? Or would some old code in you whisper that there was another way, darker and faster? Before you answer, sit with the image of 11 graves, a prison cell, and a grandson selling pinots by the highway under a name secured at such a cost. If this story stirred something in you, memories, anger, questions, tell me in the comments how your community handles betrayal and legacy. And if you want more long, hard looks at the dark corners of American folklore and true crime, subscribe and stay with us. There are more stories buried in these back roads, waiting to be unearthed.